So the main causes of World War One really stem from the major developments of the late 19th century, right? So as the 19th century is continuing on, and you have the rise of European imperialism after the 1850s or so, the rising nationalism being experienced throughout Europe. So the breakup of empires and the problems of sort of rising imperial tensions, but also rising tensions within these giant empires, there's going to be a cause for very large concern. And then you also have obviously the impacts of imperialism and the Industrial Revolution, and all those things are ultimately going to lead to the beginning of World War One. So let's sort of dive into what those major causes are and sort of take a panoramic view of what's going on in Europe at the time. So if you look around Europe as we are approaching 1914 and what we know is the beginning of World War One, you're going to see that Europe is in a very interesting position, right? France, Britain, and Russia ultimately will be allied together, while the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Germany will ultimately be allied together. And then Italy flip-flops, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But if you look, Britain and Germany are really the two dominant powers in Europe at the time, right? They are both extremely industrialized. They are both extremely strong. They are both extremely modernized relative to the rest of Europe. And they are really very strong, but they're also competing on an international stage, right? In terms of empires, they're the two that are really competing. When you look at places like France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, their power is certainly much diminished relative to Germany and Britain. They're all pretty much disunified economically. They just cannot compete with Britain and Germany. So we have situations here that are going to be creating major problems. Now, the sort of often acronym that we use to describe the beginning of World War I is MAIN, or mania, if you want to include the assassination. And I'm sure some of you have heard this before. So militarism, alliances, imperialism, industrial revolution, and nationalism. So let's just jump right in. Militarily, the late 1800s into the 1900s sees a huge jump in expenditures military goods, right? So Germany, you can see from 1890 to 1914, jumps their expending, about 4 times. So you can see just a massive increase. Britain expends theirs 2.5 times, Japan about 4 times. And this expansion, the U.S., obviously expands even probably the most of all, right, with nearly 5 times. So you can see that the expenditure for military is it going way up. We're in the Industrial Revolution, particularly we're in the late Industrial Revolution. We are in the late 19th century. So we are in that second phase of the Industrial Revolution where, in the early 1900s, you have the first automobiles, and then the Ford Model T comes out in the early 19-teens. You have the airplane being developed, and it takes a very brief amount of time for people to realize, hey, we can strap machine guns to this, and we can get this, to kill people from the sky. Or we have the creation of submarines, or we have the creation of tanks, and all of these things are new technology that is emerging in this period. But there's also another piece to this, right? That there is a love for your country that is put through the military, right? So when we are defending Britain, France, Germany, whoever, we are defending our fatherland, our homeland, our motherland, right? And it becomes this personification of sort of glory in battle. So it's the two parts of militarism, right? New tools with which to destroy, but also a passion for the people you are fighting with. There's also growing alliances. The late 19th century sees the emergence of Germany and Italy as two new countries. Austria-Hungary is a sort of new-ish country. And Britain, France, and Russia are all concerned about German expansion. And the Ottoman Empire is concerned about the expansion of Russia and Austria. So there is an alliance system that is brokered really to defend one another. Germany seeks an alliance with Italy and Austria-Hungary to defend itself from French encroachments and other encroachments. France seeks an alliance with Russia and Britain for the same reason, for the German protection from Germany. So all these things are leading to greater connections among the different European countries, but these are all protective alliances. Basically, if one is attacked, the others will be drawn in as well. So that when Serbia, who is aligned with Russia, gets provoked by Austria-Hungary, Russia will come in to defend Serbia, but France and Britain will also be brought in for Serbia. There's increased competition among these European nations for their colonies, right? So there's a growing tension among these different places for colonial expansion, and the borders in their colonies are not drawn perfectly. So when you have these growing connections among the different European powers and these different growing competitions in Africa or Asia, those tensions don't stay there. Those tensions certainly come back home. But there's also, as I've said, there's new technology being created, right? The Industrial Revolution has created new types of guns and new types of planes and all those things that allow for greater abilities to kill people. And that certainly is being drawn on here. Finally is nationalism. There's sort of two pieces of nationalism. One is love for and pride for your group of people. And that sort of, or I should say that's what it is generally, right? And when we think about places like Britain or France, there is certainly nationalism there. There is love for the English, or there's love for the French. But and in that respect, those folks would love to see their country be the most successful, right? So if you are a British nationalist, you're going to want to see the British Empire expand. But if you're, let's say, somebody who is living, in Austria-Hungary, and you are living in Romania, you may not necessarily feel love for the Austro-Hungarians. You may feel more love for the Russians. And so there's sort of two pieces to nationalism, right? There's the sort of higher level, which is connection to this empire, connection to this larger entity. But then there's also sort of the lower level, and that's sort of connection to the lower group of people. So there's connection to, there's connection to the people of Romania, the people of Serbia, who are not independent. They are wrapped up in some other entity. So what happens here is those two competing types of nationalism are at odds with one another. And then you get the assassination. So the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that happens in June of 1914, it sort of sparks all of this, right? And let's talk a little bit about who this is, right? So Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He is on a sort of diplomatic trip to a portion of the empire in Sarajevo. He's at Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And he is killed by a young radical Serbian who is part of a nationalist organization known as the Black Hand. And his assassination sort of kicks off all of these other things, right? But Austria-Hungary was not really a major player on the world stage, right? So how do you get this sort of this not even the heir to the throne of a small kingdom or small empire that leads to this global war? Austria-Hungary believed that Serbia provided backup, or provided the Serbian government provided assistance to Gavrilo Princip and the Black Hand to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary in the middle of July so a couple weeks later, sends an ultimatum to Serbia and says, well, here's the ultimatum, right? It says a couple of things, right? Basically, if you don't do these 4 things, we are going to declare war. So suppress anti-Austro-Hungarian publication, disassociate yourself with any propaganda coming out against the Austro-Hungarians, any public instruction in Serbia that doesn't necessarily align with pro-Austro-Hungary feelings, and then finally, get rid of people who from the military or government who are against Austria-Hungary. Now, Serbia does not follow through with this, right? These are blatant affronts to their sovereignty. So Serbia, if you remember back to that, the alliances, right? Serbia is aligned with Russia. So Serbia turns to Russia and says, well, Russia, if we go through with this, you have our back, right? Russia says, yes, I got your back. Russia turns to France and Britain, says the same. Austria-Hungary, turns to Germany and says, Germany, if Serbia doesn't agree and we have to go to war, you've got our back, right? And Germany says, you've got, famously, the blank check. And then Italy doesn't get involved, right? Because Italy understands, and this is pretty cool, right? Italy believes that this is a defensive alliance, right? We are supposed to be on the defense. If somebody attacks us, then we respond. This is proactive. This is offensive. So Italy backs this out. Italy says, we're going to hold on for a second. So for the next couple of months, Italy stays out, and then ultimately Italy flips because they're concerned about Germany's involvement. So all of these things bring about the war. Now, Germany had already planned something called the Schlieffen Plan. So the Schlieffen Plan was to invade Germany, for Germany to invade France through Belgium. And then once France was knocked out, turn east and go to Russia. So this was a way to avoid a two-front war, and ultimately this is sort of the first phase of attack. So World War I begins with all those different sort of lead-up, longer causes, and then you have the assassination at the end of June 1914 that sparks the beginning of the war.